Welcome, everyone. I'd like to call to order the Assembly work session on AO 2015-142 S1 cell towers. And let's go around the room for the record and do introductions.
Erica McConnell with the Office of Economic and Community Development.
Bill Evans, Assembly.
Kelvin Gray Jackson.
Dick Train Assembly.
Tim Steele.
Forrest Gumbo Assembly.
And in the audience, let's start at the side, please.
Sean Ushman, AT&T.
Ted Lyons, on behalf of AT&T.
Becky McPherson with GCI.
Dean Boyles, Verizon.
Please
Howard
introduce.
Levine, Turnitin Community Council.
Heather Nolan, South Edition. Teresa Arnold, South Edition, Margaret Noe, and Discovery Heights subdivision.
Marilyn Philippon, Registrant City Council. Henry Goodson, Turnitin City Council.
And
Barbara Jones, Municipal Clerk.
Chris Judy, Director of the Office of Economic and Community Development.
Robin Ward, Real Estate Development.
thank you. And Mr. Peterson is just doing this. Thank you. Erica, you have the floor.
All right, there are 4 pieces of paper or bunches of paper in your packet. The first one that is called Draft S1 version. This document contains amendments 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8. As many of you submitted those amendments to the clerk's office, I guess it was about 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. Since then, due to my work with the industry, Mr. Evans has agreed to replace Amendment 6 with Amendment 6A, so that is a separate sheet of paper. Mr. Weddleton has agreed to replace Amendment 8 with Amendment 9, which is the third piece of paper, and ML&P had a concern, which is really more of a housekeeping issue, and so we created an Amendment 10, which I understand Mr. Trini has agreed to bring forward instead of Chair Gray Jackson.
Thank you.
So my assumption is that at this work session, you all will discuss which amendments you're comfortable with, and then I will incorporate those into the final S1 version, which I will then provide to you for
Thank you, Mr. Hunt. You're exactly right. Okay, amendment number 6A, Mr. Evans.
Find it. I'm not sure exactly where in the packet it is, but basically it addresses.
It's a separate sheet, Bill. It's standalone. It's this one.
Thank you, sir.
And if I may, Mr. Evans, the next 3 amendments are amendments that are not incorporated in the draft version.
Yeah, this amendment just addresses an issue that was raised at our last work session on this regarding the placement of equipment in what is designated on plans to be potential pedestrian ways. And my concern was that we have a lot of plans that don't really turn into actual pedestrian ways, and the way it was originally written, it would prohibit placement of equipment in those areas. This tries to find sort of a way around that, and it allows the equipment to be placed in those areas with the proviso that should the pedestrian way actually be placed at some point, the equipment has to be removed by the carrier or whoever placed it there at their expense. So it allows them to go in knowing that there's a possibility of a pedestrian way going through there, and if it should happen, they have to remove it.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. And I just have a couple of comments before we move on. This is a 2-hour work session, and because this subject matter has been dealt with for many, many, many months, we only have 3 amendments left. What I'm going to do is allow each Assembly member to present their amendment, and then I'm going to ask for comments from Assembly members, and then I'm going to ask for comments from both the industry and our citizens. So that's how this process is going to work on these next 3 amendments. With that said, any comments from Assembly members on this amendment? Okay, I'm going to ask the industry, would you like to make a comment on this amendment? Okay, thank you. Anybody from our citizen group, would you like to make a comment on this amendment? Okay, thank you. We're now down to amendment number 9. Mr. Weddleton, is he not here? He's not here yet. Okay, I expect Mr. Weddleton to be joining us, but in the meantime, we're going to go to amendment number 10, which is just a housekeeping amendment. And Erica, would you address this one, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
MLNP contacted me they were concerned that the definition of telecommunication facilities would include fiber optic cable that was strung between utility poles, so that anytime they were to either put fiber optic cable on utility poles or put new utility poles up under fiber optic cable, that would be then considered a tower, a type 1 tower, and they would have to go through an approval process. That was not the intent, that's not how it would be interpreted, but just to make sure that there was clarity and that MLMP was happy, we replaced the term telecommunication facilities with macro antennas so that it's clear that a utility pole with one or more macro antennas on it is considered a type 1 tower rather than just the broader telecommunication facility.
Thank you, Mr. Connell. This is just a housekeeping change. I'm not going to ask for any comments from either side. Okay, Erica, would you mind, since Mr. Weddleton is not here, would you mind addressing amendment number 9 on his behalf for us?
I would be happy
Thank
to.
you.
So amendment number 9 replaces amendment number 8, which replaced amendment number 7. The original issue was that Mr. Weddleton was concerned that there was not clarity that that there was the ability to apply for a conditional use for towers that were not listed as allowed in zoning districts. And it was one of those issues that kind of got complicated and needed some time to think through, which is why we ended up with a third version of the amendment. But basically what this does is it amends the accessory use tables to say that you can do a type 1, 2, or 3 tower in residential districts, as well as some of the other, the RO district, the PLI district, and the Parks district, that you can apply for those types of towers by conditional use. However, it also takes out the language that says that if a tower is not listed in a district, you can apply by conditional use. And that's going back to the way things were organized in both the current new Title 21 and the old Title 21. So if the tower type is not listed in the district as allowed by some sort of review process, you cannot propose it. So for example, you could not propose to put any type of tower in a residential district on a vacant lot. And that, again, is consistent with how we have dealt with towers for a long time. So now the language that's in K3G that allows a conditional use for towers or antennas that do not meet the standards set forth in the section, that is also consistent with how the regulations have worked in both the new code and the old code, but it just doesn't extend into towers that were not listed as permitted in the district. And what was removed from Amendment 9 that was in Amendment 8 was the federal standard of denial would unreasonably discriminate among providers of functionally equivalent services or prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting the provision of wireless service. That approval criteria, Amendment 8 had expanded that to all conditional uses, and after discussions with Mr. Falsey, that is not, it is such a strict standard that it should not be applied to all conditional uses and all site plan reviews. It should only be limited to those situations where they're looking to exceed the standards for some particular reason. So those are the changes that are made by Amendment number 9.
Thank you, Ms. McConnell. Any comments or questions from assembly members? Industry.
Yes, Becky Winterson, on behalf of GCI. We would support this change. It addresses our previous concern have been the same as that time with Mr. Falsey, that it expanded the federal standard application in a way that we think was actually the intent of the initial language. And I think this makes it achieves Mr. Weddleton's goal of clarification while also preserving that division between the two different standards. And so for GCI, obviously, we would support this change.
Thank you. Any comments from our other citizens in our community? Ms. Gleason?
Just clarification. So, 9 replaces 7 or 8?
Both.
On both. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Schutte, do you have any comments you'd like to make?
No, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Schutte. Any other comments?
Heather Nolan, the South Edition. How is this different than what's currently available? Is that not kind of the crux of the issue, is that all of these tower types were able to be applied for a conditional use permit. And isn't that not one of the reasons why there's so much confusion of why? So they could basically apply for a conditional use permit for anything, and was that not part of the first original criteria, was trying to be very clear on what was acceptable and what's not acceptable?
So the significant change is that this scheme in this amendment clarifies that you can apply for any tower type in the district, but it still has to be accessory to a non-residential use or residential use of at least of a structure with at least 7 units or more. So you cannot apply for a tower on vacant residential land.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson, thank you, Mr. McConnell. Okay, there are no other comments, so amendment number 9. What is going to happen now, as these 3 amendments are going to be incorporated into the document, and we're going to have public, I'm sorry?
You're making this too.
I don't, was S1 wasn't introduced yet, right?
Right.
Right, so it's just, yeah. Thank you, Mr. Trainee. Right, Mr. Trainee, this draft version S1, it wasn't introduced yet. Yeah.
Then you make another S1 first.
Right, you're gonna revise this document, this S1 document, which substitute number 1 document, to incorporate the amendments that we discussed at this work session today. And on Tuesday, this is the document that's going to be moved by one of our assembly members. Right, thank you. And then the public hearing will open, and whoever wants to testify will testify, and then hopefully we'll approve this and move on. But I want to take a moment.
Not this Tuesday, the 21st.
The 21st, thank you. Why do I keep thinking it's Tuesday? The 21st, because I told folks that it was Tuesday through email, and I apologize for that. And I did send you another email, apologize, but no, it's June 21st, okay? When the public hearing will be opened, and hopefully we'll move. But I just want to take a moment to thank everybody who's been involved, and everybody's been involved. This has been a long, drawn-out process, but it was for a good cause. And I think that the way things look right now, that we have a good document that is working for everyone, and we have to always keep in mind that everybody is not going to always be happy, but I think that there's been some really good compromises on this ordinance, and I'm looking forward to having it approved and moving on June 21st. Mr. Trainee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Who do we have here from Rogers Park? Are you here from Rogers Park?
Yes.
Since Rogers Park has some concerns, how are you with this document as it currently stands?
Thank you, Mr. Trainee.
Because Sylvia and I care about it, so it's what we're to be, Councilor.
Yes, and you both have been at all of our community council meetings. You've heard the concerns from the members, and so this is, I'm getting up to speed on all the other details that I didn't pay attention to here, but I appreciate your efforts, and I still have to look at this new stuff and contemplate it.
Well, let us know if you would, please, ma'am, before the 21st.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sir?
We talked about the amendments that appeared from the table just moments ago, but we haven't had a chance to talk about the ones that were inserted into the S version. Is it possible we can address those as well?
Thank you very much for mentioning that, since we do have 2 hours. I kind of overlooked that because I, for some reason, thought they were addressed with everyone. But Erica, would you mind, Ms. McConnell, would you mind going over the amendments that have been incorporated in this S1 document, please?
Sure, I'd be
Thank
happy
you.
to. The amendments, the changes from the S version to the draft S1 version are all highlighted in yellow, and the amendment number is noted in the right-hand margin. So the first amendment is on page 4. This was amendment 1. It was from Mr. Weddleton, and it was just indicating that large antennas are often called macro antennas, and small antennas are often called micro antennas. So it's just kind of broadening the language that is often used, and in fact was now used in Amendment 10.
And one comment before you continue. I just want to remind folks that these are amendments that you all have an opportunity to look at. They were posted online, and they're nothing new, they've just been incorporated. Thank you. Please continue, Ms. McConnell.
Okay, I'm gonna skip Amendment 8 because it's replaced by Amendment 9.
Thank you.
So on page 7 is Amendment number 2. And is this Mr. Peterson, is this your amendment? I'm sorry, I don't remember who introduced all of these. No, I'm sorry, this is Mr. Weldon's. This is another amendment from Mr.
Thank
Weldon. And this is about, so this is in the submittal requirements section, and this says an applicant is required to provide evidence to demonstrate that no alternative technology can accommodate the applicant's proposal, and it's talking about what evidence can be provided. The previous language was that cost is not something that would be that would make a situation unsuitable. And this change says that costs could be considered in the decision-making body determining what is unsuitable. So if the applicant shows that using alternative technology costs, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 1.5 times, whatever, more than doing a tower, that the decision-making body can consider that in determining whether or not the alternative technology is unsuitable.
Can I ask a question for that one?
Certainly.
What is the criteria for that? I mean,
Eric, could please answer that, because I certainly can't.
cost is, I think, $4 for a carton of eggs is ridiculous. Somebody might not. So,
There's nothing else in the ordinance that says, 1.5 times is okay, but 2 times is not okay. It's gonna be up to the determination of the decision-making body.
so again, it's so open, wide open.
This is Mr.
Yeah,
Weddleton's
yeah,
amendment,
no,
so I
I
can't.
appreciate the
Yeah.
clarification.
Thank you. Please continue, Ms. McConnell.
Okay, skipping additional portion of Amendment 8 on page 9, we move to page 11, which is Amendment 3. I believe this is Mr. Dunbar's amendment, and this is stating that so you may recall that type 1, 2, and 3 towers, your monopoles, your lattice towers, and your guide towers automatically have to be constructed to accommodate 3 different antenna arrays, but that was not applied to stealth towers, the type 4 towers. So Mr. Dunbar is proposing that in your Class A districts, which are your more urban districts, smaller lot districts, that if the applicant brings either a signed letter of intent or some similar document to demonstrate that another carrier intends to co-locate on that type 4 tower, they can get an extra 15 feet of height above the maximum height in the residential district. And of course, that additional height would have to would be part of the concealed tower, so it would still all be concealed, but then you would have the potential for having 2 antenna arrays and additional height. So it's kind of going back to the scheme that existed in the current code, except the current code required that co-location will happen, and this takes a step back and says, co-location is intended, and there's somebody who's interested, but it's not going to be required. That again, it could fall through. And then in your larger lot districts, your Class B districts, there's the ability to provide a letter of intent that 2 different carriers are interested in providing co-location, and thus you can get 2 height bonuses of 15 feet each. Moving on page.
Certainly, sir.
Can I
Please.
talk to this particular amendment? I appreciate your intent, and that really comes to the word intends to. I think it should be a commitment to, a contract to. I don't think that intent is sufficient to increase the height.
Mr. Dunbar?
So I spoke with the industry about this. I also spoke with, is Gary here? I don't know if he, so the person from my part of town that's interested in this is Gary Solon. And I spoke about this, and he raised similar concerns, and I appreciate that. In speaking with industry, he basically stated they could speak for themselves if they'd like, if we allow them to, but it sounds like, given the length of time it takes to get these towers approved, that on the front end, it's just not possible to do those contracts, or it's just not a practice that's ever been done. But perhaps they could speak to that.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Would anybody like to address that comment?
Because I mean, that was initially what I wanted to do too, but it didn't sound like it was practical or possible.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I'm not going to speak to that from GCI's perspective, and for my colleagues as well. It is correct, as Mr. Dunbar stated, the challenge here is that we often propose these projects and the timeline for actual approval stretches to sometimes to years. And so practice in the industry is to submit a letter of intent, signed letter of intent stating that there is interest from another provider in co-locating on the tower, but we can't enter into a formally binding contract until we actually know whether we're going to have the tower, whether we're going to actually be able to construct, and the challenge becomes just, again, the timeline is extremely lengthy in large part because the permitting process is not a simple or short one. And so we can get an initial commitment from a provider, but there is always something that may change in the course of 1 to 2 years before something, before a tower is constructed. So this, I think, walks a middle path between requiring that, and requiring the equipment in the form that is industry standards before any kind of height increase is permitted, but also allowing for that first unlimited height increase to facilitate that kind of co-location. And as we discussed previously, the challenge is if it's not built in at this point, then these type 4 towers are extremely difficult to re-engineer after the fact in order to add an additional provider. And generally, antennas are not mounted right at the top of a stealth tree structure. They're not mounted slightly below the top, and we end up in a situation where the structure is just not co-locatable at all if the additional height isn't built in from the get-go. But I'll look for dependency and make for additional comments.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to make another comment?
I appreciate the interest in co-location. I think our group is definitely in favor of co-location. The collaboration of the industry to sign each other's towers, letters of intent exists, and I would prefer it to be a commitment.
Thank you, sir.
I think,
Mr. Dunbar?
can I add one more thing to that?
Please.
My understanding, again, speaking with industry, is that these type of towers are quite expensive to build. And so, again, I share your concern there. But I don't want to create a system where we're unintentionally disincentivizing co-location and forcing people to build multiple towers if for example, the height isn't enough. And if they're going to build these relatively small Type 4 towers at significant expense, I think the combination of the letter of intent and the economic forces that already push them towards the co-location will hopefully allow that to happen. I'm not sure if there's much more we can do.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. For the record, I'd like to recognize that Mr. Weddleton has joined this work session. Okay, you had your hand up, sir?
Oh, I was just gonna say, so the letter of intent goes away, but then we have a tower that's 30 feet higher than it should be, so what do we do?
Well, the 30 feet would only be in the B districts, which are like parts of the hillside and the river. And my understanding from Amy gave some good testimony last time. They actually want the taller, for the geographic reasons. I think some of those districts want some of the taller towers because of the space involved. So it wouldn't be 30 feet; it'd be 15 feet higher. But you're right.
Can you let him finish, please? And then-
There's,
thank
there's
you.
at least some risk that the carriers will build a Type 4 tower that's 15 feet higher, and then renege on their promise to co-locate. It's a risk. I'm not going to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Sir?
Maybe I misread the amendment. I think I saw 30 feet in there too.
30 feet is for so Class A districts is basically all of downtown, West Anchorage, East Anchorage, all of the sort of core urban areas. And Class B, although it's not perfectly, aligned, it's most of Hillside, is that right? And then most of Eagle River should be.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Do you want to make one more comment?
So if I'm understanding, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but anything goes in Class B districts.
No, sir.
They don't matter as much as
No,
the
sir.
other districts.
They can apply for up to 30 feet more.
Right.
And then in Class A, we can apply to up to 15 feet more.
Right. But if, again, the letter of intent goes away, and they're in a Class B district, they now can have 30 feet.
So the letter of intent comes at the front end.
Right.
Then they get approved for that, and they build 30-foot extra, they build a tall type 4 concealed tower. And then and then you're right, if the other carrier, or one or both the carriers decide not to co-locate, then yes, you could end up having that taller
I see.
tower.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Steele?
But they also bore the expense of assuming that this other company was gonna come in and put a tower, and they overbuilt their tower, so they paid more for it than they would normally.
Excuse me, let me just make one comment, okay?
So it's a risk.
I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you, Mr. Steele. Okay, this is an assembly work session, and I am indulging comments from the industry and our citizens, but I'm calling on the assembly members and the administration first to make their comments, and then I'll go to you, okay? So have a little bit of patience, thank you. Ms. McConnell?
I just wanted to state that even if the original letter of intent falls through, the tower is still available for future co-location should a different carrier come in later, because it is always cheaper to co-locate on an existing tower than to build an entirely new tower. So just because the intention falls through at the beginning doesn't mean that there will never be co-location on the tower. There is still that potential.
Thank you, Ms. McConnell. One moment, please. Sarah, you were next.
Yeah, no, I was just following along with what Erica had mentioned. Also, there was a new feature in the code that requires co-location if you're within a half mile of an existing tower. So if that space is available, and say that the previous letter of intent had fallen through, no one would be able to build a new tower within a half mile of that tower without, going on that tower, because the space, of course, would be available for it. So that is another feature that's in this code that also provides additional protection that additional towers would have to be built.
Thank you, Sarah. You had a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one point. This is that industry arguments get into contract with people, just like with churches. They get into a lease, a contract, where they actually pay for space before a conditional use permit is approved. So they actually do get into contract prior to. So this idea of intent versus contract, I don't really understand the difference of why they can get into contract with churches or other businesses for lease space with the intent of building a tower, yet they cannot get into contract with other companies to sublease or co-locate. Just drawing comparison.
That's a good question. Someone from the industry be able to answer that.
I can speak to our practice generally. We do enter into ground leases with landlords, and each of those ground leases generally have a term that allows us to cancel upon if a permit is issued. So it really is provides no more assurance to that landlord than a sublease would. But also the tower doesn't exist yet, whereas the land does exist. We essentially enter a land lease with the underlying landlord and say, okay, you have this land, you own it. We're going to enter into a lease with you for land you own. If we're unable to permit as a tower, then we are out of that lease. Whereas we don't enter into leases where the tower itself or it exists.
Thank you. Sir?
That same contract between the tower provider, builder, and contractor, and the co-locator can be subject to that tower eventually being constructed. So that doesn't help you.
Sir, would you like to respond?
Sure. I think one of the challenges, of course, is that, sometimes it could take a very long time, whether it be with issues with the ground owner or through the approval process. There's an amount of uncertainty about actually how much height are you going to get, and is the tower actually going to be approved? It won't be approved in the original location you've actually designed it for. And then on top of that, each carrier is certainly deploying its dollars to improve its network. And if the tower takes too long or whatever, those dollars might be spent elsewhere. Not that they would renege on their letter of intent, but it might be delayed. It certainly could be delayed. That certainly does happen as the uncertainty of these projects, as they are complicated land use decisions move forward.
Thank you, sir. Want to make a comment?
Yeah, I would say, it's to the industry, it's dollars and cents, but to the public that has to experience these towers every day, the taller towers than they may need to be. How do you quantify that? It can be quantified maybe in dollars and cents, but it's kind of the appearance of the community too. So if we're gonna consider dollars and cents all the time, I think we need to somehow take into account what the public may or may not see.
Thank you. That's what we're doing at this work session.
Yeah.
Ms. McConnell, please continue. Did you want to make a comment before we, on this particular subject?
Clarification.
Okay, good.
So in the District A, where you could add an additional 15 feet, then what would that maximum height of the stealth tower be?
In a residential district, it would be 8 feet, 55 plus.
Thank you. Ms. McConnell, please continue.
The next amendment is on page 13, this is amendment 4. I believe this was put forward by Mr. Peterson and Mr. Wilson, I think. This was something that we had brought up in the last work session during the staff's presentation as a recommended amendment. So we did discuss it then, but basically this does recognize that there will be reasons why one cannot maintain a half-mile separation between towers in all situations. And so it allows the decision-making body to reduce that half-mile separation requirement rather than pushing the applicant into a conditional use every single time that they may need to construct a tower that's closer than half mile to another tower.
Thank you. Any comments from the Senate members? Industry? Mr. Peters, you have a comment? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And my reason for introducing this amendment was I thought a hard and fast line in the sand half mile sometimes may actually cause there to be an additional tower need to be built, where if they had a little leeway and could go 100 yards or 200 yards one way or another, they could get the coverage they needed, and that additional tower would not have to be built. So you would end up with less towers if they had just a little bit leeway than if you went with a hard and fast half mile. Because I actually have 2 towers that are less than a half mile from me, and I'm lucky if I get 2 bars on my phone. So just because there's towers in this a half mile doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get the service coverage. It depends on the topography, the hills, the buildings, the trees.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Comments from our citizen group? No? From the industry, any comments on this? Please continue, Mrs. Connell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The next amendment is on page 16. This is amendment number 5. I believe this was put forward by Mr. Peterson. And again, this was one that we had discussed at the last work session. This was language that the Planning and Zoning Commission had recommended removing. It's about what is considered stealth. And this language basically says paint may be considered stealth. It doesn't it's not automatically considered stealth just because they have some sort of paint scheme, but that it can be considered. And I refer people back to that photograph that we've included in a lot of our work sessions of a church. And again, it's not a church in Anchorage, but there's a brick church, and the antenna that's mounted on that brick church has it is painted like brick so that it is stealthy, it's concealed. You can't see it very easily. And that is a situation where the paint scheme does work to achieve the concealment. So this just provides that option for the decision-making body to determine that a paint scheme does achieve the intent of the concealment requirement.
Thank you, Ms. McConnell. Any comments from Assembly members? Industry, any comments? Our citizen group, any comments? Sir?
I think the language without paint causing it to be stealth is sufficient. This, to me, leaves an opening for a tower to be painted like a tree. And it bothers me that it gives the opportunity for something that would be fairly obvious to be painted and claimed to be conspicuous.
Thank you. Please continue, Ms. McConnell.
On page 17 is amendment 6, but Mr. Evans has a 6A replacing this, so I'm not going to speak to that. And then the other amendments were in the table attachments at the end of the document. Those were all part of amendment 8, which is being replaced by amendment number 9, which we have already discussed. So that's all of the amendments. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome. Any comments from the Assembly members? Okay, any last comments from the industry? Okay, time's up. Okay, any last comments? Okay,
Yes, I testified on May 24th, I was the only one, since I won't be here on June 21st, and I was wondering if any of the assembly or staff is considering my input and my proposals for amendments.
anyone like to respond, in particular those who were representing the district?
I
Just
wasn't
throwing
at the
it on
meeting
you.
yet. I mean, I don't know.
Well, would you like a copy and consider?
If you've got an extra copy,
I
take
do.
one, sir.
And Ms. Gleason, it may be a good idea to send your comments again.
I do.
That would be great, thank you. Pam?
Oh, let's see, so, I'm a little confused here. In South Anchorage, around Bay Shore, Discovery Heights, Discovery Park, what height is being proposed?
In residential districts, towers have a 65-foot height limit. However, a good portion of, I think it's Bay Shore is in the PC district. Who's I talking to about that word? Southport, okay. So maybe Southport is not what you're talking about,
Yeah.
but you are at Southport. Southport is governed by a planned community master plan, which, and so I'm not entirely sure what that master plan says about cell towers. But your general height limit for residential districts is 65 feet.
And then, are you saying that a co-location is allowed?
If a carrier is going to build a type 4 tower and they have a letter of intent from another carrier desiring to co-locate on that tower, they could, if it's in an R1, any of the R2 districts, R3, R4, or R5, they could get an additional 15 feet so that they would have to construct the tower so that it could accommodate 2 antenna arrays. If it's in the R6 through the R10, they could get, if they had 2 letters of intent from 2 different carriers saying they both intended to be on that tower, they could get an additional 30 feet, so 15 feet per additional antenna array. And the tower would have to be constructed to accommodate 3 different antenna arrays. But again, we're only talking with concealed stealth towers.
Now, I have a question, okay, so the answer was, in that particular area, we're talking 65 feet,
As in base height, yes.
and then one coalition
I'm not sure what the zoning is.
would be R1 residential.
R1, then it would be one potential co-location.
And that is extremely high. You know, when you're talking stealth, I'm not sure how you can conceal something that is 80 feet high, and I don't know how in our association, we have to tell people when it's time to paint, because their paint peeling off isn't good enough. We've got to tell them that your paint is peeling off, you need to paint. So how in the world would we ever, number one, conceal something that high, and number two, who would decide the paint is peeling off, or the branches that were supposed to look like a tree are threadbare?
Well, the decision-making body on whether or not the tower is sufficiently concealed would be the planning director through an administrative site plan review. The process would go through a public notice, so property owners and residents within 500 feet of the proposed tower would get notice that they could comment on the application. If a tower was constructed and the public felt that it was being run down and there, branches were falling off or whatever, they can make a complaint to code enforcement, and code enforcement would come out and evaluate whether the tower still met the original approval criteria, which would be that it has to be constructed when it was approved. And if it wasn't in that situation, then the owner would have to fix it.
more appropriate for the public hearing, but there's such strict covenants in there. Even the fire station that was built is 1.5 stories, and it's designed to look like, almost like a, residential, and you can't build over 2 stories. So, this is so far, it would impact every property in there, because it wouldn't matter where you own property, you would see something that is 80 or 85 feet high.
Thank you for your comments, ma'am.
Marilyn Cole, Office Clerk. I haven't read through all of this, version 1 version. And so could somebody tell me here where we find discussion about small cell technology? Is that even addressed in this version? Is the Assembly even considering any small cell technology development in this town? I mean, honestly, we're talking about monopoles, towers, and I have not heard anything about small cell technology. As far as are there incentives for industry to develop and deploy?
Ms.
small cell
McConnell is going to address
technology?
your question.
So one incentive to do small cell is that it only requires an administrative permit. So there's a very quick approval process, and time is something that is an incentive. But the approval process would ensure that the small cell installation met the requirements, which start on page 16 on line 38, and it's called antenna only small. And so there are a series of 11 particular standards for small cell.
Thank you, Ms. McConnell. Would you like to follow up?
Could I do a follow-up, please?
Certainly.
So, I guess this is to industry. Who is looking into small cell technology deployment in the Anchorage area?
Sir?
I'm glad you're looking into it very aggressively. We've deployed small cell, and I believe other carriers, I know AT&T as well, and GCS looked into it. It's something we, in the lower 48, we've deployed extensively, in addition to our macro cells. They work together.
What about Anchorage specifically?
When a need comes up for it, it will absolutely do it, and that will probably see, this is public information, we'll probably see that come as the public demands more capacity and more coverage. You'll see small cells as an option.
If I could just make on, I think that's what we're seeing in the neighborhoods in the downtown area of this park, in particular South Edition. There is a demand for that sort of technology and deployment, and yet here we are still talking about monopoles or monopines. So I'm very confused and dismayed.
If I may. The macro cells are the large cells versus the small cells.
I understand.
They work complementary, not from a replacement standpoint. The radio frequency propagation, there's a height requirement to get propagation. I think that's part of the intent behind co-location, is get as much things put together so we can cover as much without having less sites. Small cells accomplish significantly different, they address different problems than macro cells do. So the two work together, not a mutually exclusive.
Sir?
I'll comment on behalf of AT&T, and we do also have small cell technology in Anchorage deployed in kind of more of the stadium arena. And I believe that we're actually
Actually,
do
that's
together.
a good point, yes.
Yeah, so we do have that, and again, I think it does speak to the type of, it's a technology that really does address a type of demand, and that's a high capacity need in a confined area. And frankly, at the moment, it's not suitable for most parts of Anchorage. It is suitable for some parts, and over time, it probably will get included together, and again, in a complementary fashion, as my colleague says here. Both, you're gonna have macro sites, you're gonna have small cells, and they're gonna work together, and more small cells will be added, certainly as the demand, the way that people use their phones, and the way that the amount of data that they're demanding from their devices increases. We will need more small cells to help account for that. We won't be able to get it all, with just macro sites. So it's important that the code, at least from our perspective, have the flexibility to be able to maintain the macro site network, have the flexibility to deploy small cells as it's needed, as demand grows, and have that flexibility throughout the city, given that the way that people are using their phones, as you know, is changing rapidly. So.
Thank you.
I would just, the second and third, looking to a little better, I call it Senate midweek. GCI also does have small cell deployments in Anchorage on the Providence campus, on the Alaska Regional campus, and in Sullivan Arena. And we do look at small cells as an option when we look at gaps in coverage, but as both David and Ken have stated, at this point they're largely not appropriate for the type of coverage needs that we're addressing elsewhere in the city. Anchorage is the most dense urban location that we serve as a company. We, unlike Verizon and AT&T, don't have a history of deployment in more dense areas outside Alaska, but we do continue to look at that. We actually have a number of new engineers working for the company who have come from outside, who are familiar with the technology, who look at where it may be appropriate, but at this point our deployments are limited to the same locations where Verizon and AT&T have deployed the technology in sort of more dense, specific building, and the hospital campus locations.
Thank you.
A quick comment is that I went to a Rogers Park meeting where GCI was proposing this new tower, and one thing that they said that just sticks out in my mind is that they had these 7 towers within a certain radius, but they had to add this new tower that was going to be called the dominant tower. And so what happens is those 7 towers were competing with each other. And I am not a cellular engineer, but if the idea is that it spreads out this information from these macro towers, then doesn't it stand to reason that we already have the need for this small cell technology or these smaller antennas within those areas that are not being reached by these competing towers? And so in my mind, if these 7 towers that are already in the Northern Lights area are competing and they want to add a new dominant, where does it stop? Again, that's like a dominant or a macro tower on every block to fill in all of these areas that other cities are using antenna attached to light posts and signal lights to fill in those gaps. So you can go to other cities that are very much topography, geographically like Anchorage, and you don't see towers like you do here. The proliferation of towers here is, you just don't see it. So these dominant towers, where does that end?
Would you like to respond?
I can offer, I guess, a more truncated version of what is a fairly lengthy engineering explanation for that piece. Essentially, and again, I'm trained as an attorney and not an engineer, but the specific issue with that site is that there are sort of 3 things we aim to address with any tower construction. There's coverage, there's quality, and then there's capacity. And those are sort of the driving forces for each of the types of construction that we propose. And the vast majority of our projects so far in Alaska have been driven simply by coverage needs, because we're trying to reach places where there's 0 service. And now we're kind of getting to the next phase of working on our network where we're addressing quality issues and capacity issues. And the issue with Rogers Park is a quality issue where there are the calls in that area. There's no site directly serving that area. There are multiple sites located around the fringes of it that serve some portion of the area, and it leads to a high frequency of drop calls. So you look at your phone, you have bars on your phone, but the capacity of your phone to actually connect to one site, maybe connected to our connection to that site over the duration of a call is impacted by that construction. And so the need pinpointed by our electrical engineering team was that we needed to have one dominant site for that area, which would allow calls to remain connected in the neighborhood and not be dropped over time. The challenge that came up in analyzing a small cell solution for the neighborhood is that small cells essentially create more sites that are also competing. So they don't create one dominant site for an area. They create there's these other macro sites competing for coverage, and they create a number of microsites that each then compete for coverage. They each cover a very small radius and increase the issues with competing sites and a lack of a dominant site. The engineering value that we're trying to maximize is ECIO, which is, I understand, a ratio that basically equates to signal versus noise in wireless coverage. But again, not an engineer, so I'm happy to refer anyone who has additional questions to our engineering team about that site. But the long and short of it is there are several different things that a wireless provider is looking to do in constructing its infrastructure. Again, we're looking at not just coverage, but also quality and capacity. And so explanations are somewhat complex. They are engineering issues for why we would need to build out our network. But it's not simply, we're moving past just coverage to these other issues that allow us to offer a functioning network to wireless consumers.
Sir, you had a comment?
Yeah, just, just that we have a burden we want to make sure our service works really, really well, that's certainly what our customers expect. They want their phone calls, they don't want to drop calls, they don't want a situation where they can't access either the voice network or the data network, things like that. So these are the types of challenges that our engineers have to go through. They wouldn't want to deploy a macro site at a stadium, for example, because there would be so many people there. The carrying capacity of how much that macro site could occur is not a good fit for that situation. That's why small cell was deployed, because it's a lot of people confined one space. They're able to break down that stadium into individual areas and really maximize the capacity. On the other side of things, let's say you want to deploy a small cell in a residential neighborhood. Well, because they are such low power, will they actually be able to reach the house? And if someone is talking on the street and then they go inside their house and they drop the call, that actually creates an issue. So small cell in that particular environment may not be the best fit for technology, which is why we go through this pretty detailed analysis to understand what is the best technology to fit the need that's being presented. And sometimes if you're trying to deploy a small cell, one of the criticisms you see as it's been deployed in other parts, if you try to deploy small cell as a replacement for macro sites, is it actually creates a lot of holes because the limited radius of the coverage of those small cells, and the clutter, in other words, the physical density of the wall, whether it's made of CNU block or if it's wood or whatever, people have a lot of performance problems with being able to use their phones that way. And so these are the reason why engineers look at that to say, okay, in this situation, it makes the most sense to put in a macro site and then maybe supplement with small cells in certain areas. In this type of environment, maybe it's a high density, high traffic environment. It makes sense to put small cells in because that's that type of technology works well. And so those are the types of questions in engineering analysis that we have to go through to make it work.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Dunbar?
Yeah, I have a question. I think it's for Erica. This is a definitional question. So those tubes that are on the side of this parking structure over here, are those considered small cell, or are they considered like a type 4 tower? Is there another term for them? So
They're considered macro antennas.
So they're not small cell, but they're not towers.
Correct.
So how do we categorize those exactly?
If you look in attachment exhibit B or any of the exhibits, they would be antenna only large. So, which is how we regulate antennas on buildings. Anything else?
No, it occurs to me that those are much less disruptive than a full tower. And if we had more large apartment complexes and other dense housing neighborhoods, perhaps we could put more of those on there, like on Inlet. Perhaps you guys are open to that. But I do hope that we are incentivizing those, because I think it's better than constructing a whole separate tower.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar.
Marilyn Philippon again, for the record. I guess this might be a question more for industry, but to the chair. So the monopole time at 2702 seems to be a building capacity pole. And I'm wondering what the expected potential capacity will be with that monopole.
You're looking at the specific project we proposed for the 427. So that pole is designed to solve the quality issue that I just outlined. And then also, as part of that, to be the primary pole serving the Rogers Park area. I can send you the propagation map again, which shows basically that here's a targeted polygon that is the area that will be the service area for that tower, and the coverage will be provided for that. It's actually also in the application that I was going to print out for you for next week.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. But I think that pole also also be able to broadcast out farther.
It won't, its service area will be basically limited to the Rogers Park Light. I think I'll send you the map so you can see where it's designed to fill in, but it will resolve those quality issues. It's targeted to resolve the quality issues for users that are located within that area. It's not,
This is not designed to develop potential capacity.
I believe that there are a few streets within the Rogers Park neighborhood that are still targeted as not as lacking capacity entirely, even despite the coverage from other nearby towers, but the primary purpose of it is to resolve the quality issues in the area.
Thank you both. Do you have a comment?
What is the range of, typically, of a tower that's 65 feet with a couple of co-locations?
I would address it. It completely varies based on mostly topography and clutter. So how far that coverage extends will depend on, 65 feet on the top of a bare hill in an area where there are no trees could be coverage that stretches for quite some distance. 65 feet in a hilly area with a large number of trees and a large number of tall buildings could be a block. So it completely depends on where the tower is located and what's located around it.
I thought that I thought it was miles.
Again, it completely depends on what's around it and how much, the frequencies that cellular technology operates at are impacted by things like walls and trees and other man-made structures and foliage that the frequencies may bump into. So it completely depends on how much of that is around the tower, how tall that stuff is. Are the trees 20 feet tall? Are they 80 feet tall? And then again, is the tower down in a valley? Is it on top of a hill? How high is the tower relative to the surrounding property? People who are trying to obtain coverage from it is an enormous difference on what the tower covers.
Thank you, sir. You had a comment?
I was just gonna add to that, the first wireless networks were built 30 years ago. Typically, they were on towers on top of hills, and they propagated for miles and miles. You'd only have a couple of sites that might serve an entire city at that time. And you've seen sites get, become a lot closer where people live, a lot closer where people work, a lot people where they travel. And generally speaking, they've gotten shorter, and they've had to be, because we only have a certain amount of frequencies that the FCC allows us to, or that we purchase, I should say, to be able to provide service with. And there's a carrying capacity, a number of users that can actually be on that, using those frequencies at the same time and still experience quality service. So whereas we may have had relatively few customers, we could get by with just a few towers. Now we have, now everyone has a cell phone, and not only do they have a cell phone, they're using them, to consume enormous amounts of data. We've had to build much more dense networks closer to where people are, so that they can have quality experience. And also, of course, the way people use their phones, today versus 30 years ago is really remarkable. That's generally what's happened.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Training.
Just changing technology and changing use patterns, correct? Because years ago, you're an adult, if you got a cell phone and you bring and took it with you. Now we have 4- and 5-year-olds whose parents give them a cell phone so they can tell where they're at, or another device. So you're gonna have to have more cell tower, more carrying capacity, because it just grows. As it succeeds, it's growing huge.
Yeah, there's a couple of factors that go into that. Number one, I think all of us are trying to get as much frequency as we can from the FCC to purchase to try to keep up with demand. The second thing we're all doing is we're all trying to deploy the latest technology possible. So we've gone from like 2G to 3G to 4G, and each generation there's a lot more capacity available just because of, so that's another way we're able to keep up with it. And then the third thing we're doing, of course, is we're trying to build more sites to be able to, so those are like a three-pronged attack, if you will, to try to keep up with demand, if you will.
Thank you, Mr. Training.
I was watching TV last night and saw an ad for a refrigerator that has 3 cameras in it.
Yeah.
Well, if you've got multiple cameras inside the refrigerator, you multiply the amount of houses in the neighborhood, that's just one device, and they're all competing for bandwidth.
That's absolutely correct. In fact, just AT&T statistics for since the advent of the iPhone, our data traffic has increased 150,000% in the last 8 years. It's mind-boggling. And certainly, you know, with the prevalence and the even more wireless devices and connected cars and connected refrigerators and dishwashers and who knows what we'll come up with next, it certainly is there. But, you know, I think that just speaks to why I think the opportunities that we're talking about in this code to make sure that we make things look good by being able to do stealth sites or things like that, you know, we've kind of moved past the time where we were just trying to, okay, just build all the cell towers in the industrial areas and we'll be fine. And now we really do need wireless facilities everywhere, but we're also coming up with new ways and certainly looking forward under the new code to figure out how we can build the least intrusive sites, most well-integrated sites we can, recognizing that this capacity is really needed to keep up with the tremendous growth curve.
So much demand.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. Trainee, the refrigerator commercial, I think we've all seen it. But if you like me, you don't need a camera to tell you what's in your
That's because
refrigerator.
no one lives in your
You
house.
know what's in your
No one lives in your
refrigerator.
house but you, and
Side
they
note,
line.
side note. Okay, any, sir? You want to make
Thank
a
you.
comment?
I'd just like to thank this body, the planning and zoning, the staff, all the citizens and industry for spending the time over the last year trying to make the ordinance as good as it can be. It's not perfect, but I think we appreciate where we're at today and would be happy to get it approved and behind us. I just want to remind everyone that I did attend that webinar from FCC, and the guy that was kind of talking about residential service said with the combination of the macro stealth tower, monopine, or whatever it is, the church steeple, in addition to small cell, was where we would be and where we should be.
Thank you. You have a comment?
Yeah, I may be naive here, but I'll use a phrase that's been thrown about quite a bit. I'm not a federal engineer at all. But we're just looking, and I go back to what Heather said before on the front row here. I'm Lance Powell with Mid Hillside Community Council. Her phrase was, where does it all end? I mean, we've talked about the multitude of uses, and they're increasing. And we now have 3 providers, and we have a community, Rogers Park, that appears to me is not a lot of topographical features to it. But meanwhile, we have 7 towers around this community, and the industry has problems serving it. So what do? Do we allow them to put up more and more towers? And what happens when another provider comes in, another 2 providers? I mean, again, where does it all end?
Thank you for your comments. Okay, any other comments from assembly members? Okay, last comment. Ms. Jones, you want to make a comment?
Ms. Gray Jackson, I'd like to make a comment before you end the work session about your next work session.
Okay. Why don't you do that now, because I'm about to end this work.
Okay. Your next work session on Title 15 was scheduled to start at 3, but we did publicly notice it for 2:30, just in case this one finished early. So we'll start the next work session at 2:30, provided I see 2 of the speakers here, and we'll make sure that the other 2 get here. But I just wanted to make sure that the assembly members that were going to stay for the Title 15 work session.
Thank you.
Is that right? Is it Title 15?
17.
Okay. 17. Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. We appreciate that. Mr. Trainee?
Pete, I just want to thank you for taking leadership on the cell tower. You did a great job.
I echo Mr. Trainee's comments. And with that said, thank you everybody for being here. Work session